Great. Well, welcome everyone to the January edition of the ICCS Journal Club. Today we have one of our team members speaking. We have Dr. Roly Perera, who's one of the early career advanced fellows at ICCS. He's going to be talking about his work at the Institute on this exciting programming language called Fluid. The title of the talk is Fluid Data Transparent Visualizations, something that he's been working on for a while, which we think has particular relevance to the Vesri teams and to people broadly working in the sciences. So without further delay, I'll pass over to Roly to give us today's talk. Thanks, Roly.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. So as Dominic mentioned, I'm a programming languages researcher at ICCS, and today I'm going to talk about a project called Fluid, which is a collaboration between ICCS and the University of Bristol. So Fluid is a programming language and visualization library which supports transparent visualizations. And by that, I mean visualizations or other outputs which are able to reveal how they're related to data. So we understand and make decisions about the world around us using data. So this data has been curated by scientists and journalists into charts, figures, reports, articles, and so on. And these figures here are taken from the Working Group 1 Summary for Policymakers from the last IPCC assessment report. So we have a chart here, but it's not clear just from looking at the chart and the legends, perhaps, what we're looking at or how these things were calculated. There might be some accompanying text, but it's not clear what science is being referred to or where these numbers come from, for example. And there's a lot of nuance here. Confidence, for example, is already some kind of second-order property of the data. And then we can add to that the fact that we might have low confidence for different reasons because there's insufficient agreement or insufficient information, for example. So, of course, these comprehension challenges aren't just limited to policymakers. If we're reviewing a paper, there may be tacit references to data sets. There may be visual features whose meaning isn't clear. There may be multiple channels of visual information whose interpretation isn't immediately apparent. If we're reading a news article about global warming, there may be technical concepts we're not familiar with, like rolling average. Or there may be suggestions of other related information, like these faded points in the background, if you can see that. If we're playing with an interactive simulation, like this En-ROADS simulator from MIT, it may not be clear what the actual underlying data is. Well, in this case, where does historical data turn into projected data? Or what parameters are actually being tweaked when we track this data? So these problems are in some sense intrinsic to the goal of trying to condense a very complex situation into a simple narrative. So by their very nature, these sorts of artifacts are optimized for specific audiences with specific needs. But they're opaque in that they don't allow a reader to peek under the hood. And that's a significant problem because it makes these things hard to evaluate and make sense of. So open science is, of course, a response to exactly this sort of problem. The idea being that if we have the raw materials used to do the science, if it's publicly available, then we should be able to reconstruct the conclusions for ourselves and perhaps understand them better or be more confident in them. But if you think about open science, from a kind of user experience point of view, then the situation is only slightly better than what we had on the previous slide. So I might have an article or a paper that I'm trying to understand. If it's open science, then I can go to GitHub or Zenodo and download some source code and data. But it can be hard enough just to get these things running again. Actually using them to understand how the outputs were derived from the data is a much harder proposition still. And the problem is that the raw materials alone are just passive documents. They don't provide any direct assistance with my original comprehension task. So this challenge for open science is emphasized quite nicely in this Royal Society white paper from 2012, which makes it clear that what we actually want from open science are ergonomic qualities. We want scientific claims to be easy to trust or critique and easy to engage and make sense of. And anyone who's worked in reproducibility or peer review will know that these are as much challenges for experts as they are for non-experts. Okay, so how can we think about addressing this disconnect between the data and the discourse? So I think we can think of this as a software infrastructure problem. So computational notebooks are a step towards addressing this, but each cell in a notebook still operates as a black box. So what I'm going to introduce in this talk is the idea of a transparent programming language. So a transparent programming language retains metadata about execution into the final artifact, and then uses that additional information to support provenance queries directly through the artifact. So these are kind of complementary ideas to some of the ideas in computational notebooks. And we're not going to attempt this for every step in a climate science pipeline. This isn't going to be feasible for physics simulations, for example, but we can think about doing it for the more user-facing parts. And this idea that I'm calling data transparency is just the first step in this direction. I'll talk about some ways of extending it later. So I'm going to start with a demo of transparent visualization, to illustrate the basic idea. So I'm going to take you to, well, we've got a template repository which you can instantiate and use to create your own, as a starting point for creating your own visualizations. And if I go to this URL, there are a bunch of visual sort of examples already running. So I'll just show you the basic idea using one of these examples, and then we'll see in a minute how you actually go about creating one of these using Fluid. So what we have here is we're plotting some non-renewable energy output, sorry, for various countries. And on the right, we have a scatter plot showing nuclear output versus nuclear capacity. And whereas on the left, we've got the kind of legend and the captions and so on are telling us something about what we're looking at. That's a little bit less the case with the plot on the right. So the first idea of a transparent computation is just that we can access a view of the underlying data set directly from the chart itself. So this produces a view of the data set where we're only showing rows that are relevant to either of the two visualizations on the right. And we can do that just by tracing how the data flows through the computation. But once we have that information, there are other kinds of queries that we can support. So, for example, I can move over the nuclear capacity column here, and I can see that various points in the scatter plot are being highlighted on the right. So these are the scatter plot points that are consuming the data under my mouse cursor on the left. So as you move around in this column, you'll see that there are always three other elements that are also highlighted. These are the other inputs in addition to the input under my mouse, which are needed to compute the scatter plot point on the right. So I can make this a little bit more visible by clicking on one of these points. So the element that's highlighted in green is, if you like, my primary selection, and then the elements that are highlighted in gray is the secondary selection, which shows the other inputs that are also relevant here. And what's going on in this case is that scatter plot point on the right represents a particular year, and for that year, the nuclear capacity for these four countries was added together in order to compute the y coordinate at this point, which is why we always see these four mutually related values. So this is imperfect information in the sense that there's nothing that visually tells us that these inputs are only being used to compute the y coordinate. But it's a start. It gives us a kind of unit of comprehension in the sense that these four inputs are used together to compute some feature of the output. If we now move to the nuclear output column, then we see something slightly different. We also see four mutually related values as we saw before. And if we look at the numbers involved, we can see that they were probably used to compute the x coordinate. But we can also see that the coal, gas, and petrol output are also being highlighted. And if you look carefully as I'm moving around in this column, you'll see that the various bars in the bar chart are being highlighted. So at this point, we might wonder whether the coal and gas and so on are being used to compute the height of the bars in the bar charts, perhaps with nuclear output contributing to both. So there are various ways we can start sort of playing with this hypothesis. So one will be to approach things from the other direction. So we could, for example, move over here and interact with the bars in the bar chart. And indeed, we can see that there are 4 non-renewable sources of energy that are being aggregated in some way here. Now, you might notice that as I'm moving around in the bar chart, there are still scatter plot points being highlighted on the right. That's a clue that there is some intersecting data usage, as we conjectured earlier about nuclear output. So we can investigate that by making one of these selections persistent, and then we can move over to the highlighted point in the scatter plot. And if we look at the data needed for that point, we can see that it does intersect indeed at this nuclear output field. Whereas the other points in the scatter plot don't have any intersecting data. So formally, this is dual to the notion of related inputs that we started with. Related inputs, in some sense, are related because they contribute to some shared feature of the output. Related outputs are related because they demand some kind of shared part of the input. And you might recognize this related outputs idea as a form of brushing and linking from data visualization. But the difference here is that we can do it in this kind of transparent way, where we are able to explain why 2 particular selections are related. Okay, so let me just move back to my slides. Okay, so this is the basic idea of what I mean by data transparency. And there's a lot more to do to turn this into a mature feature, but it's already able to reveal quite a lot about what's going on under the hood. Now, the key thing that Fluid brings to this picture is that the author of the visualization hasn't had to program any of these interactions themselves. So this is the source code for the 2 plots. Fluid is a pure functional language with familiar data structures like lists, arrays, and dictionaries. And the programmer is just responsible for describing how to map data to visual elements. The Fluid runtime keeps track of the dependency information and makes it available to the rendering layer. And then the rendering layer is able to automatically add interactions to allow the user to formulate the kinds of queries that I just showed you. So they come as a kind of built-in transparency feature. So for the next example, I want to show you the kind of authoring workflow. So I'm going to switch to a local version of the website now. Okay, so this is a kind of local clone of the repository I just showed you. Fluid is an NPM project, so I can just do a yarn install. It's actually already been installed, so there's not much to do there. And then I can build, if I do a yarn bundle, it will publish the 3 example figures that come as part of this template repository. And then if I do a yarn serve, it will serve those images on localhost. So if I open local browser, this is the example we were just looking at. Let's look at this moving average example now. So I'm going to explain this example first and then show how we can modify the example to get to different provenance behavior. So this shows projected methane emissions under a particular scenario called SSP5. It plots both the projection and a rolling average for the projection. So as before, we can open a data pane, which shows the underlying data. And for example, we can see that each year contributes to a single point, both in the projection and its rolling average, whereas each emissions value contributes to 1 point in the original projection and 3 points in the rolling average. And those 3 points that consume the data under my mouse actually need 5 inputs. That's why we see this window of 5 kind of mutually related inputs here. So in other words, if I care about this 61.27 under my mouse, then those other 4 inputs are something I also need to sort of take those into account in order to understand the contribution of this number to the output. And this is a little bit more clear if we just go to the output, and then we can see that each point in the moving average consumes 3 points of the emissions data. So again, this is only partial information. It's not a complete explanation of moving average, but it does go some way towards revealing what's going on. It shows us, for example, the size of the window. And the point again is that these interactions come for free. and the user just writes vanilla visualization code. So this is the visualization code. This is the logic for the moving average example. This constant here specifies the size of the window to the left and right of the central point for the computation of the moving average. So one thing we could do is change this from 1 to 2.
You just zoom it a little bit more, Roly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If I now bundle the website again and reload the page, I just open up developer tools so there's no caching, then we get a slightly smoother curve as you would expect, but we also get slightly different provenance behavior. So for example, if I select one of these points in the output, I can see now that it's using 5 emissions elements in order to compute that point in the moving average. Okay. So the change to this sort of behavior isn't something I had to explicitly program. I just expressed a slightly different algorithm, and the visualization behaved in a slightly different way. Okay, so the idea is that we want to support an active form of comprehension. So when a reader is consuming visual information, they have various hypotheses about what they're looking at. And we want to allow a reader to imagine experiments that would confirm or disconfirm those hypotheses, experiments that they can then run by interacting with the visualization. So by surfacing, the effect is to sort of surface some of the implementation details into the user interface so that you can interact with different algorithms to understand what they do. Now, I'm making a fairly strong assumption here, namely that features like these do actually help comprehension. We don't have any data to back that up at the moment, but we do have some user studies planned for later this year, which will hopefully address that. And as with computational notebooks, the big picture here is that we want to bring these two worlds together, the world where we do the science and the world where we share the science. Okay, so for the final example, I want to focus on a slightly different application, more oriented around science education. So you may be familiar with distill.pub. It's an online journal from Google Brain that publishes interactive essays explaining challenging ideas, such as convolution in neural networks. So these are sometimes called explorable explanations. So these sorts of outputs also make extensive use of visualizations, but they're very labor intensive to produce. So let me just show you an example of one. So this is an article from DistillPub, and it has this nice interactive presentation of convolution where you can interact with input cells, and it shows you kind of how that's being related to various elements in the output and the kernel and so forth. So what I can show you now is an implementation of that in Fluid. So let's run this example, and then we'll come back to the code and look a bit more closely at the implementation and perhaps change the implementation and see how it affects the visualization behavior. So if we go back to our locally running version of the examples, so we're looking at the output of convolution. I'm able to, as before, reveal the inputs. In this case, the inputs of the filter and the input image. And I can now interact with parts of the output and see which parts of the input were needed. So as I move around, I can see that only certain parts of the input are relevant. And I might notice that there's this kind of slightly odd shape in the parts of the input that are needed. And I might kind of surmise that that's to do with the presence of the zeros in the filter. So I can start kind of exploring those sorts of ideas a bit more by moving around in the output. So if I move to the edge, then I notice something perhaps a bit surprising. I notice that some of the filter becomes irrelevant. So in that case, I might suppose that that's because the input image is being treated as though it were padded by zeros when I get to the boundary. So I can sort of test that hypothesis, if you like, by perhaps moving to another edge. That gives me some confirmation of that idea, because I can see another part of the filter not being relevant. That in turn might suggest what would happen if I go to the corner, which I can sort of think of as the union of those two queries. And then I may go a step further and say, well, I'd expect this pattern of usage to be kind of symmetric. So I can explore that by making this into a persistent selection and then moving my mouse to the other side of the input and seeing that it is indeed sort of symmetric. So as before, these interactions are provided for free. The implementation just expresses the algorithm directly. So let's see now what happens if we change the behavior of the algorithm. So let me first just mention these brackets. So this is a kind of comprehension-like array initialization form. If you're curious about this font, this is a version of Ubuntu Mono with ligatures. So what we're going to change is this function boundary. So what boundary does is, given an index n and given the maximum sort of permissible value for that index, returns what actual index value we're going to use. So in this case, it's just saying ignore the maximum. If n is out of bounds, just return n. And what that means is, a consequence of that is that this guard here is just going to exclude that index from the calculation of the weighted sum. And so the effect of that is to treat it as though the kind of out-of-bound indices essentially contain zero. So that explains the behavior we've just seen. What we could do is try and re-implement a different behavior for boundary that does some wrapping. So for wrapping, we're going to use a kind of modulo operator. Now, there's a kind of odd feature of Fluid, which is that the array indexing is one-based. Don't ask me why that's the case. It's definitely going to change. So we have to jump through a little loop in order to express what we want to do. So we take the modulo, we subtract one, take the modulo, and then add one. That should do it. Okay. Now, if we republish the website and go and refresh our view of the convolution algorithm, then as before, we can interact with the output and we see the same sort of thing going on. But now the behavior as we approach the boundary has changed. So we see all of the filter being relevant. We don't see any kind of irrelevant parts of the filter anymore. Instead, what we see is the parts of the image that are being sampled are coming from the other side of the image, as you'd expect. And again, we can do the same kind of experiment to confirm our intuitions as we did before. We can go to the other side. We can go to the corner, and we can make this kind of into a persistent selection and then check what happens if we go to the opposite corner. And again, we see this kind of symmetric view of things. Okay, so as before, the emphasis here is very much about supporting comprehension as an active process of interacting with inputs and outputs. And this could be useful for creating explorable explanations and other educational materials. But whereas the DistillPub article was a bespoke visualization designed to illustrate an algorithm, what we have here is a transparent algorithm which is able to reveal something about how it works. So this is a kind of step towards a sort of self-explanatory artifact. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now and talk a bit about what we're currently working on and planning to do next. So the first is how to make this idea a bit more of a mainstream feature. The second is how we can extend this idea of transparency to the text that accompanies charts and figures. And then the third thing is going to be how we can enrich this basic idea of data transparency into something that I call computational transparency. So I'm afraid this is going to be quite brief, so feel free to ask me more about this afterwards. Okay, so the first question is how we might make this idea more mainstream. So I think there are two ways that we can sort of come at this problem. The first is to make Fluid more like existing languages. So we've been experimenting with a kind of more Python-like syntax And from a bit of prototyping, it looks like we could adopt a subset of Python syntax without too much difficulty. And then we could also develop some libraries with a small core of features from Python libraries like NumPy and Pandas. And that might help in terms of making it easier to port an existing visualization from Python to Fluid. And it would just be more accessible and familiar. So another more ambitious direction would be to look at adding provenance tracking to a more modern language like Julia. So Julia is a more extensible language than Python, and it also doesn't have the pervasive C dependencies that Python has. So it might be possible to add provenance tracking as a zero-cost abstraction. In other words, a feature that doesn't cost anything if you don't use it. So the opportunity here is quite big because obviously there's a big base of Julia users, but it would also be quite a big engineering effort. So the second kind of project that we're working on at the moment is something that we call transparent text. So the observation here is just that things like the IPCC report that I showed earlier, as well as scientific papers and news articles, make important scientific claims using text as well as figures and charts. And that text can be quite hard to interpret. We find things like graded adjectives, there's iteration, there are whole part relations, there are sort of quantitative or semi-quantitative expressions all over the place. And so the research question that we're asking here is, can we enable this supporting text to be transparent in the same kind of ways as we would like to do with visualizations? In other words, can we make the text itself data-driven, self-explanatory, kind of verifiable? So our working hypothesis is that there are three ingredients to making this work. So the first is transparent programming languages of the kind I've just been talking about. The second you could think of as, or I'm describing it here as a kind of literate execution or first-class documentation. So what I mean by that is the ability to decorate a computed value in a computational pipeline with some documentation that explains how it's computed. And in contrast to literate programming, that documentation is actually retained into the kind of runtime structure of the output. And it's able to refer to the values and variables and so on that are in context. So that would support documentation that actually refers to some of the computed content that it's associated with. And then the third component is some kind of AI tooling for making it practical to author this sort of content, because you could imagine what you want is you're authoring, a report, for example, and you're writing just natural language. What you would like is some kind of tool that's able to make guesses, hopefully accurate guesses, about what you might be referring to using natural language, and underwriting that with references to, for example, parts of visualizations you might be referring to, specific data sets, or queries over those data sets that you might be referring to, results that have been established in earlier parts of the paper, and building in links to those texts, to those computations into the actual text itself, so that the final artifact is kind of enriched with this transparency. So the final strand of work that we've just started that I want to mention is to make it, this is something that I call computational transparency. So the idea here is to kind of enrich the basic data transparency idea with explanations of how things were calculated. So these are some mock-ups inspired by spreadsheets. So data transparency is this idea of associating specific output features with a minimal set of inputs that suffice to reproduce that output feature. And the idea of computational transparency is to enrich that provenance information with an actual executable subprogram that does reproduce the feature. So for example, suppose we select a bar in a bar chart here, as well as being able to summarize the four pieces of data that were relevant, we can actually produce an explanation that shows that they were added together to compute the height of the bar. And over here, we might select these 2 points in the scatter plot and see that each point was computed by dividing the USA and China data in a particular row of the data set. So to derive explanations like this automatically from the program would require the original program to be expressed in a certain way. So in this case, we would have needed to have actually written the program using data cube operations like roll up, pivoting on country, column-wise operations, and so on, which are not actually, in this case, how we implemented these visualizations. So in other words, to be kind of useful, this kind of transparency requires a close match between the problem domain and the solution domain, because we're really revealing something about the solution into the output. Now, so this is what mathematicians refer to as intentional rather than extensional. So data transparency is purely extensional. Computational transparency is a kind of intentional enrichment of that idea. The idea would be to have things like the IPCC report or the BBC article I showed earlier that's able to reveal how it works to a reader. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of a conclusion, but feel free to ask any questions. Thanks for listening. These are the people who have made great contributions to the project. And please do get in touch if you'd like to find out more, or if you have a project of your own that might lend itself to this sort of treatment. And you can find us online at these, GitHub and Blue Sky here. Okay, thank you.